Want to talk a little bit about values and why values, I think, should be consistently applied, but specifically in the context of geopolitics and armed conflict. Um, Now, I'm not naive. Geopolitics always has vested interests. Every government has them. Um, every government naturally has self-interests. And in real politics, in the real world, often values aren't consistently applied. But I think for nation states, and it's often leveled at the West, the perception that there is double standards or a lack of consistency, I think, is an Achilles heel that can sometimes be used. The thing about totalitarian states and dictatorships, otherwise dictatorships, they're absolutely hypocritical in some of the standards they apply, or rather in some of their, victimhood narrative, but they don't care. You know, I think where it's particularly taboo with Western countries is Western countries talk about human rights and make this a central focus of their values. So that's why I think, for example, if to use the UK for instance, if we're seen to be backing Saudi Arabia when it's partly responsible for a famine in Yemen, when we are backing Israel when there are definitely questionable things going on in its Gaza campaign, then it does leave us vulnerable to accusations of lacking consistent values. Even if Western leaders will speak out and call in, rein in on, or not rein in, but publicly express concerns about some of the things that are happening. Um, Now, I don't think it's possible for nation states to just sit on the sidelines and be absolutely neutral on every issue. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But it is incredibly important, I think, that consistent standards are applied. Now, in war or armed conflict, even lower level insurgencies and so on, um, something that should be absolutely non negotiable is the deliberate targeting of non-combatants should be considered wrong. It should be considered crossing a line. I don't care if it's a nation state, the forces of a nation state, or a militant group, terrorist group, depending on what your perspective is. I don't care who is doing it. It's wrong. And this might sound a bit idealistic and utopian, but for me, I'm not interested in making any excuses for any combatant who abuses a civilian. I don't care what side they're on. I mean, to me, that is just a no brainer. If someone is a civilian, a non combatant, and who do we mean by that? We mean unarmed women, unarmed men, vulnerable people, elderly people, children, disabled people. Yes, technically, there could be some caveats here. You could have a disabled fighter who's technically a combatant. But even for militants, even whether they be soldiers or militants, there are still a certain degree of humane standards need apply, i.e., treating the wounded to some extent, um, not degrading prisoners of war, that sort of thing. Um, a few weeks ago, actually, I think it would have been about November now, there was footage emerged in Gaza of the IDF leading Palestinian men basically naked except for underwear through the streets. Now, no doubt the IDF said that this was suspected Hamas fighters. Maybe they were. And I understand that soldiers have a right to look out for their safety as well. So, someone could have explosives, or there are those sort of situations in warfare. So I'm not naive about that. But they also need to understand the outside world is looking in, and there are still certain standards as to how you treat prisoners. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm no dewy eyed liberal on this subject. I think that terrorists, people who are deliberately targeting civilians, have crossed a line. And, if they need to be taken out fatally, so that's what has to be done. For example, speaking domestically, if we have a situation where you have an armed terrorist whether they be Islamist or from some other ideology, and they are armed and they're attacking members of the public, I absolutely support a shoot to kill policy. Why? Because you cannot negotiate with someone in that situation. The only thing you could do is neutralize the problem, to use that blunt military language, or blunt, um, you know, police language. That has to be the option, because you cannot, in that situation, say we're going to negotiate this person who's running rampage. No, they have to be killed for the greater good. This is why I cannot be a pacifist. And I should say, by the way, as a point with this video, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not speaking as a pacifist. But to me, degrading civilians is repugnant. And, when people say that Hamas are freedom fighters, just so that people don't think I'm picking on Israel here, when they say that Hamas are freedom fighters, a freedom fighter, someone who's a genuine resistance fighter, does not target civilians. No, during World War II, resistance movements in Europe, in Greece, in France, and so on, Norway, they sabotaged railways. They blew up cafes where German officers were stationed in, but they were specifically targeting German military personnel. Now, it's true there was some vigilantism after the war with suspected collaborators. It's one of those dark things of history. Whether it was right or wrong is a matter of debate, but the point is the focus was on German soldiers, which I think was completely legitimate. They were occupying an occupying force. Um, this is very different from what terrorist groups do, which is deliberately target civilians to try and pressure governments. What Hamas done on October the 7th was unquestionably a terrorist attack. It was not an act of resistance, because the young people, the young women they kidnapped, young men too, elderly men, elderly people, vulnerable people, not combatants, just young people enjoying a music festival. That was not an act of resistance. You could say it was an act of anger that boiled over. You could say it was, their apologists could say whatever they want, but it was not a valid act of resistance. Had they attacked an Israeli military checkpoint, that would be a different matter. I'm not saying I would agree with it, but that would at least be a military target. This is why terrorists deserve to be called terrorists. And I have a big problem with calling them resistance fighters. But having said that, Israel is fast running the risk of being called a terrorist state. Not my words. I am saying that that is how it will be perceived if it is seen to be engaging in collective punishment. Now, I'm talking a lot here about Israel and Gaza, but this can apply to any war. And sadly, in pretty much every war, civilians suffer, even more so in modern wars in some ways. A lot of 19th century conflicts, you would have a standing army formation versus a standing army formation, and quite often civilians were far from the front line. With many modern wars, they're absolutely in the midst of it. Not just in the Near East, you find this particularly in African conflicts, and there's some really horrendous things go on there. For example, women are used deliberately to punish the other side, where you get mass rape. Um, So there's some horrendous things go on in armed conflicts, but there should be no excuses made for targeting non-combatants. Um, and I know it's easy for me to say this behind a computer screen, far from any conflict, but this has to be the consistent standard. Otherwise, values become meaningless. And I think there has to be a consistency whereby we are prepared to also express caution or concern or even condemnation to our allies when they cross a line. Now, I will put it this way: I've been absolutely staunch, 100% my support for Ukraine, far, far more than Israel, although I did support Israel initially. With Ukraine, I think they are in a battle for survival against an invading force. Now, if Ukraine was to start targeting Russian civilians, um, I couldn't support that. I would still support the overall principle of Ukraine's resistance. There has been, it has to be said recently, a couple of reports of Ukrainian strikes in the Russian city of Belgorod, where there's been civilian casualties. Now, Ukraine has to be careful there because if there are Russian civilians being killed, that will obviously just be used for Russian propaganda. I don't think it is anywhere near the level of atrocities that Russia has committed, not even close. There is no equivalent of Bucha or Kramatorsk or Mariupol. So I don't think that in any rational sense of the word there is a moral equivalency going on here. But even one Russian civilian would be wrong because Ukraine has the moral high ground here, so it shouldn't lose that. That's how I feel about it. Um, so they have to be careful there. If it's accidental, they should be careful. And if it's deliberate, that's foolish. It's not the right strategy. Um, but I want to be clear that I don't think it's on anywhere near the same scale as what Russia has done in Ukraine. Um, but in any armed conflict, this shouldn't be a controversial thing to say. It shouldn't be something that even generates a lot of debate. It should be a no-brainer. Civilians are not a legitimate target. And incidentally, that includes journalists and aid workers. You know, journalists have a right to report the news, even if they are working, even if they're partisan and they're working for a particular government. Um, they can be called out for their bias, they can be condemned, but ultimately, if the non-combatants are non-combatants, uh, I despise RT, but I wouldn't advocate killing RT journalists. I believe in calling them out, condemning them, um, even arresting them if they're engaging, for example, in kangaroo trials. If you have a situation, for example, where there was someone who was working for hostile foreign media and a hostile adversary, and they were complicit, for example, in the kangaroo trial of a dissident or a British journalist or something like that, I would definitely support pushing some sort of legal measures against them. But journalists are not armed by definition, so in that sense, they're not a legitimate target. Um, I remember in the Iraq War when America bombed Al Jazeera's headquarters, that was a very controversial incident. Al Jazeera, again, like any network, it's biased, but ultimately it is still a news network. Um, anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I really think, this is idealistic. I'm not naive. This video isn't going to change anything in terms of how armed conflicts are fought, but I just think it is. I'm just expressing my view that it is very, very important that nation states, particularly those um, that really put a focus on human rights and democracy, have to show that they're consistent. Now, to be clear, I do not think that the situation with this country is comparable to what is going on in Russia right now, and I take issue with anyone who wants to draw moral equivalencies, but it would be an Achilles heel if we are called out on it. So there has to be there has to be a willingness to also criticize allies when they cross a line. That's why I give credit to Chuck Schumer for criticizing Netanyahu and some of Israel's actions. He's a long-standing supporter of Israel. They can hardly call him anti-Semitic. Um, Drew Pavlo, Australian human rights activist, I have enormous respect for that guy. Why? Because he has been absolutely consistent. He has condemned Hamas unequivocally, but he has also condemned Israel when it's crossed the line. One of the things with this conflict, particularly, is people get so tribalized. They either blindly support the Palestinians or they blindly support Israel. I think both positions are wrong. Even if you're of the view that the Palestinians are an oppressed people, Israel's an occupying force, etc., anyone who tries to defend Hamas, to me, that's an argument that really lacks moral objective because they're trying to defend a group that not only, by the way, targets Israelis, they will target Palestinians as well who don't ally to their hardline Islamist dogma. Um, Other Palestinians, indeed Fatah, apparently has recently accused Hamas of being responsible for the suffering in Gaza. Um, so I think Hamas are bad news. I have no interest in any sort of argument that seeks to downplay or defend Hamas or describe them as legitimate resistance fighters. They're not. But I do think, like I say, Israel is fast losing support with some of its actions. Um, and, saying that does not make me an anti Semite. I do think, I will say this just to close up, there are some people, whilst I've condemned anti Semitism and I do think it's a problem, I do feel there are some hardline pro-Israelis who will use that as an excuse to deflect legitimate criticism of Israel. I haven't said this enough before. I do think sometimes that happens. Israel is not above criticism, and that's what some Israel supporters need to. Naturally, they're going to defend Israel, but they cannot say that criticizing Israel is in of itself anti-Semitism. I think when it becomes an obsessive focus on Israel and ignoring what Arab dictators do, then yes, that might be something else. But criticizing Israel in of itself is not anti-Semitism, and it must be protected as a matter of freedom of speech. That must be protected. But yes, non-combatants in warfare, this should be a no-brainer. There is no excuse, no ifs, buts, or maybes for for targeting them. And if you get rogue soldiers, incidentally, who do this, nation states need to show that they're better than terrorist groups by holding those rogue soldiers to account. If they hurt civilians, they should be court-martialed or otherwise punished. There is no excuse, none.